For many of us, to genogram our family was very difficult to do. We commend you for your courage. The story of the Israelites coming out of slavery in Egypt is a great picture for us. They lived for 400 years as slaves. They had other gods, they lied, they stole, they coveted, they worked 7 days a week. Although God had delivered them out of Egypt, Egypt was still deep in them. They were freed by grace, but they still had their family's ways of doing life in their bones. They had to be formed now as God's new family. So God gave them the 10 Commandments. In the same way, God gives us Scripture. We call this the work of discipleship. That is why it is so important that we become deeply aware of the commandments of our family. Most were never spoken, but they are in us. The principle is you cannot change what you are unaware of. So look in the workbook and consider the sample of family commandments. We chose 10 very common ones. For example, look at the first commandment on money. Some of us were taught things like money is the best source of security. The more money you have, the more important you are. Or make lots of money to prove you made it. I know a young man named Stephen who found himself in almost $30,000 of debt. Overwhelmed and frustrated, he looked at the largeness of what was ahead of him. I invited him to do a brief genogram of how his family handled finances. So I asked him a simple question: how were finances handled in your family? We sketched out a 3-generational genogram looking at how his grandparents and his parents dealt with money. The pattern was unmistakable. There was debt, mismanagement of money, and many financial struggles. This awareness took him on a journey to change that legacy.
Let's look at the commandment of anger. How'd your family do anger? Was there only one person who was allowed to be angry? Did your family stuff anger, then explode, or leak it out in sarcasm? Was anger dangerous or suppressed? We had a husband share with us a story about his wife who would lash out at him and verbally attack him. I asked John if he had anger toward his wife when this happened. "Oh no," he said, "I'm not allowed to get angry with her. She's only allowed to be angry with me." The story then spilled out that John grew up with an alcoholic father who took his anger out on the family, but the family was never allowed to be angry with him. John had an internal rule that said, it's not safe ever to show my anger. So he was allowing his wife to disrespect him rather than assert himself. The question is, how do we do anger in the new family of Jesus? God says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. He also says, be angry, but don't sin. God has given us our anger to assert ourselves, not attack others, especially when we are being disrespected. Let's look at the commandment of grief and loss. How did your family do grieving? When I was in the 2nd grade, my grandfather died. I have an indelible memory of coming upon my mother in my grandparents' basement. She quickly turned her head so I would not see her crying. As a 7-year-old, I can still remember the jolt of fear in my body because 1, I had never seen my mother cry, and 2, because there was something happening that I wasn't supposed to be seeing. And this would be just one of many messages from my family where I internalized that showing sadness or weakness must be bad. My mother didn't know how to grieve because her family didn't know how to grieve. When she was 9, her sister, just 1 year younger than her, died. It's very traumatic for a child to lose a sibling. Her parents did not know how to talk about that tremendous pain of that loss with their children, and they turned to alcohol instead. But what does God say about grief and loss? Well, it's such a significant part of life that 2/3 of the Psalms are about grief. And we have a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations on grieving. Since life is filled with losses from birth to the grave, it's essential that as members of the new family of Jesus, we acknowledge our losses. God uses our losses to meet us in ways we had never imagined. Now, please turn to your workbooks and follow the instructions.